The apple tree in my front yard died the winter I turned 32. Not slowly, not ambiguously. It just stopped. I had planted it 3 years before with what I can only describe as reckless optimism. A bare root Fuji I ordered from a catalogue that described it as adaptable to a wide range of climates. I remember the catalogue photograph, a tree loaded with glossy red fruit against a perfectly blue sky. And I remember thinking that photograph had absolutely nothing to do with my life in Zone 4, where January temperatures regularly drop to -25 degrees Fahrenheit and where spring sometimes arrives as a brief, violent suggestion before summer heat sets in. But I planted it anyway, because that is what you do when you want fruit and you do not yet know any better. The following spring I waited. I watched the neighbouring trees leaf out, the elms and the cottonwoods, and the old crabapple at the edge of the property that nobody planted, and nobody watered and nobody cared about, and that had apparently been producing fruit since before I was born. My Fuji stayed bare. The bark on the lower trunk had split in a way that told me everything I needed to know. I dug it out on a cold April afternoon, with the ground still half frozen, and I stood there holding the dead root ball and feeling the particular kind of foolishness that only comes when you have failed at something you were warned about, but refused to believe. My neighbour, a retired extension agent named Walter, who had been growing food on his property for over 40 years, came over that evening and looked at the hole in my yard. He did not say "I told you so," which was generous of him, because he had in fact told me so. What he said instead was that I was thinking about this wrong. He said I kept looking at the cold as the enemy, as the thing standing between me and a productive orchard. He said the cold was not my enemy, it was my filter. It was the thing that eliminated every weak, poorly adapted, shallow-rooted option and left only the trees that had been hardened by thousands of years of genuine northern conditions into something close to indestructible. He took me out back to his property and showed me what he meant. There was a Dolgo crabapple heavy with deep red fruit, a Manchurian apricot with bark so thick and rough it looked ancient, a row of hascap bushes I had never seen before, and at the back of everything, a Korean pine that was already producing edible nuts. None of these things looked like the catalogue photographs. They looked better than that. They looked like they belonged exactly where they were, completely at home in the cold, completely unconcerned about winter. That afternoon changed the way I understood cold climate growing entirely. The problem was never my climate. The problem was my plant list. Walter had figured that out decades before I ever picked up a catalogue. What I want to do today is give you the fruit tree knowledge that took me years of dead trees and frozen disappointment to accumulate, organized as a working system rather than a collection of random recommendations. These 11 trees are not survivors of cold winters. They are built for cold winters, shaped by cold winters, and in several cases they actually produce better because of them. Let us start where Walter started me, with Malus baccata, the Siberian crabapple. This tree is native to Siberia, Manchuria, and the mountainous regions of central China, which means it evolved in one of the most brutally cold temperate climates on the planet. When temperatures at its native range regularly reach -40 degrees Fahrenheit, a Zone 4 or Zone 3 winter is not a stress event. It is a familiar season. The Siberian crabapple handles cold down to -50 degrees Fahrenheit in many documented cases, and it does so without the dieback, the cambium damage, or the root kill that destroys less adapted trees. The variety I recommend most consistently for productive cold climate orchards is the Dolgo, which Walter grew and which I have grown for over 15 years since that conversation in his backyard. Dolgo produces fruit that runs about 1.5 inches in diameter, bright crimson, with a tart flavor that makes exceptional jelly and that wildlife absolutely depends on through fall and early winter. A mature Dolgo of around 15 years will produce 40 to 60 pounds of fruit in a good year. The tree begins bearing at around 3 years from planting, which is fast for a tree that will outlive most of its owners. Siberian crabapples also perform a function that most fruit tree lists overlook entirely. They are the most reliable and most cold-hardy pollinators available to northern orchardists, extending the pollination window for apples that might otherwise set poorly in cold springs. Plant dolgo and other Siberian crabapple varieties in full sun, with a spacing of 15 to 20 feet between trees. They tolerate a pH range of 5.5 to 7.5, which means they will grow in almost any northern soil without amendment. Dig your planting hole 3 times the width of the root ball, but only as deep as the root flare. Never bury the graft union, and water deeply at planting and weekly for the first growing season. After that, these trees are functionally drought-tolerant. The second tree on this list is Prunus manchurica, the Manchurian apricot. And I want to spend a moment on why most gardeners in cold climates have never grown an apricot, despite wanting to. The problem is not apricots. The problem is European apricot varieties bred for the relatively mild winters of France, Spain, and coastal California. Those varieties are cold hardy to perhaps minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit on a good day, and they bloom so early in spring that a single late frost wipes out the entire crop. Grow one of those in Zone 3 or Zone 4, and you will have a beautiful tree that produces fruit once every 7 years, and you will conclude that apricots cannot be grown in cold climates. That conclusion is wrong. The Manchurian apricot evolved along the Korean-Manchurian border in conditions that matched northern North American winters almost exactly, including the late killing frosts that make commercial apricot production elsewhere a gamble. Manchurian apricot blooms about 2 weeks later than European apricot varieties, which moves the bloom window past the most dangerous frost dates in cold continental climates. The tree is cold hardy to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit at the root level and to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit at the flower bud level, which is significantly hardier than any European variety. The specific variety I recommend is Scout, developed by the Agriculture Research Station in Morden, Manitoba, specifically for the Canadian prairies and northern United States. Scout produces 2-inch golden orange fruit with a sweet rich flavor and a freestone pit that makes it easy to process. A mature Scout tree at 10 years will yield 30 to 50 pounds of fruit annually. Plant at 20 feet spacing in full sun, in well-drained soil with a pH between 6.0 and 7.5. Apricots are more sensitive to wet feet than almost any other tree on this list, so if your soil drains slowly, plant on a slight slope or mound the planting site 4 to 6 inches above grade. Number 3 is Pyrus ussuriensis, the Ussurian pear, native to far eastern Russia, Manchuria, and northeastern China. This is the tree that should replace European pears in every cold climate orchard, and the fact that it has not done so yet is a genuine failure of mainstream gardening education. Ussurian pear is cold hardy to minus 45 degrees Fahrenheit. It blooms later than European pears, reducing frost risk, and its root system goes deeper and wider than European pear rootstocks in a way that gives it access to subsoil moisture during dry summers. The variety that performs best across the broadest range of northern conditions is Ussurian, a Canadian prairie selection that produces small 2-inch yellow pears with the kind of buttery sweetness most people do not expect from a tree this cold hardy. Ussurian begins bearing at 4 years, and a mature tree will produce 25 to 40 pounds of fruit annually. The flavor improves dramatically if you harvest the fruit while still slightly underripe, and ripen it indoors at room temperature for 5 to 7 days, a characteristic it shares with most high-quality pears. Plant Ussurian pear at a spacing of 15 to 20 feet in full sun, soil pH of 6 to 7, and note that like most pears, it requires a second tree for pollination. Any 2 Ussurian pear varieties will pollinate each other effectively. The fourth tree is one that most North American gardeners have never heard of, and that gap in awareness costs them every single year. Diospyros lotus, the date plum or lotus persimmon, is a small to medium persimmon species native to Southwest Asia and the southern Caucasus Mountains, where it has been cultivated for over 3,000 years. Unlike the American persimmon or the Asian khaki persimmon, Diospyros lotus is cold hardy to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit without protection and has been documented surviving minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit in sheltered sites. The fruit is small, about half an inch to 1 inch in diameter, dark blue-black when fully ripe, with a flavor that tastes like a combination of dates, plums, and brown sugar. The tree reaches 12 to 15 feet at maturity, making it one of the more manageable options on this list, and it produces reliably in years when most other fruit trees struggle. For cold climate production, I recommend sourcing named seedling selections from specialty nurseries rather than depending on seed-grown plants, as seed-grown trees show significant variability in cold hardiness. Lotus persimmon prefers a soil pH of 6 to 7 and is more drought-tolerant than any other tree on this list once established, largely because its root system penetrates deeply into subsoil, even in compacted conditions. Plant at spacing of 12 to 15 feet in full sun to partial shade. A mature tree will produce 15 to 30 pounds of fruit annually with almost no maintenance after the establishment period. Tree 5 is Prunus sericis, the sour cherry, and I want to be specific here because the term sour cherry covers an enormous range of cold hardiness and productivity. The sour cherries that belong in cold climate orchards are not the Montmorency trees you will find at big box garden centres, which are cold hardy to about minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit on good rootstock. The trees that belong in this discussion are the Prairie adapted varieties developed in Canada and the northern United States, specifically for Zone 3 and Zone 2 conditions. Carmine Jewel is the variety I recommend first. It was developed at the University of Saskatchewan and is cold hardy to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. It grows to only 6 to 8 feet tall, which makes harvest practical without ladders, and it is self-fertile, meaning a single tree produces a full crop without a companion. A mature Carmine Jewel tree of about 8 years will produce 20 to 30 pounds of deeply colored sweet tart cherries annually. The flavor is rich enough to eat fresh, concentrated enough to make outstanding preserves, and the sugar content is high enough that these cherries ferment beautifully if that matters to your food system. Plant Carmine Jewel and other Prairie sour cherry varieties at 8 to 10 feet spacing in full sun. They are more tolerant of clay soils than most stone fruits, but they still need reasonable drainage. Amend heavy clay sites with compost worked into a planting area at least 6 feet in diameter before planting, and water weekly for the first full season. The 6th tree is Amelanchier alnifolia, the Saskatoon serviceberry, which occupies a special category on this list because it is technically not a tree, but a large shrub that can be trained into tree form and that produces more fruit per square foot than almost any other plant adapted to severe winters. Saskatoon is native to a range stretching from the Yukon to the upper Midwest, which tells you everything you need to know about its cold hardiness. The plant survives minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit routinely. It blooms early but recovers from frost damage better than any other fruiting plant I have grown because it carries enough bud redundancy that a frost that kills 20% of the blossoms simply allows the remaining 80% to set larger fruit. The variety, Smoky, is the benchmark for cold climate production. It produces sweet, blueberry-sized fruit in heavy clusters that ripen all at once in late June to early July in most northern regions, making harvest efficient. A mature, smoky Saskatoon of 10 years will yield 40 to 60 pounds of fruit in a good year from a plant that takes up roughly the same footprint as a standard fruit tree. The fruit dries beautifully, which was how indigenous peoples of the northern plains preserved it for winter nutrition for centuries, and it freezes without any quality loss. Plant at 10 to 12 feet spacing for tree-form Saskatoons, or at 4 to 6 feet if you are growing them as a managed hedge. They tolerate a wider soil pH range than almost anything else on this list, performing well from 5.5 all the way to 8.0, which means they will grow in alkaline prairie soils that defeat other fruit plantings entirely. Tree 7 is Cornus mass, the Cornelian cherry dogwood, which is not a cherry at all, but a member of the dogwood family native to the Caucasus region and southern Europe. I include it on this list for a specific reason that most fruit tree discussions miss entirely. Cornelian cherry blooms before any other fruiting woody plant in the northern garden, sometimes in February or March, when snow is still on the ground, and yet the flowers themselves are cold hardy to about 15 degrees Fahrenheit, which means they survive late frosts that would destroy the blossoms of trees that bloom later but with less frost-resistant flowers. The tree is cold hardy to minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit and tolerates a wider range of soil conditions than almost any other fruiting tree. growing well in pH ranging from 5 to 8, and in partial shade that would reduce other fruit trees to ornamentals. The fruit is a 1-inch bright red drupe with a flavor that lands somewhere between a tart cherry and a cranberry, with a richness that makes outstanding preserves and a sourness that concentrates beautifully in cooked preparations. A mature Cornelian cherry at 15 years will produce 30 to 50 pounds of fruit annually. The variety Elegant is my consistent recommendation for cold climates, selected for larger fruit size and higher sugar content than wild-type plants. Plant at 15 to 20 feet spacing in full sun to half shade, with no special soil preparation required in most northern soils. The 8th tree is Elaeagnus umbellata, the autumn olive. And I want to address immediately the controversy that surrounds this plant in North America, because that controversy is partly justified and partly a failure of nuance. Autumn olive is listed as invasive in parts of the northeastern United States, and in those areas I am not recommending it for open planting. What I am recommending is that growers in Zone 3 and Zone 4 regions, where it does not spread aggressively, consider it seriously for its food production value, because no other tree on this list fixes atmospheric nitrogen the way autumn olive does, and no other tree produces edible fruit with 20 times the lycopene content of raw tomatoes from a plant that is cold hardy to -25 degrees Fahrenheit. The fruit is small, about 1/4 inch, red with silver speckles, sweet and slightly astringent when fully ripe in September and October. The flavor improves significantly after a light frost, which concentrates the sugars. A mature autumn olive of 10 years will produce 40 to 60 pounds of fruit annually on a plant that requires no fertilization because it meets its own nitrogen needs through root-associated bacteria. For food independence purposes, the nutritional density of this fruit is almost unmatched among cold-hardy options. If you are in an area where it is not invasive, it earns a place in any seriously designed cold climate food system. Plant at 10 to 15 feet spacing in full sun. Autumn olive thrives in poor, rocky, sandy or disturbed soils, where most fruit trees would starve, making it particularly valuable for establishing production on marginal land. Soil pH tolerance runs from 5 to 8. Tree 9 is Hippophae rhamnoides, the sea buckthorn. And this is the tree I most consistently recommend to people who tell me they have a north-facing slope, a windswept location, a compacted soil situation, or any other growing condition that has defeated everything else they have tried. Sea buckthorn is native to the coastal cliffs and mountain valleys of Central Asia and Russia, which means it evolved specifically for exposed, nutrient-poor hostile growing conditions. It is cold-hardy to -45 degrees Fahrenheit. It fixes atmospheric nitrogen like autumn olive, meaning it builds soil fertility rather than depleting it. The root system is among the most aggressive in the cold climate fruit world, capable of stabilizing eroded slopes and penetrating compacted soils that would stop most trees entirely. The fruit is remarkable. Small, bright orange berries clustered so densely along the branches that the branches themselves are barely visible at peak harvest, with a flavor that is simultaneously tart, sweet, and rich in a way that is unlike anything else in the northern fruit palette. The nutritional profile is extraordinary, with vitamin C content that rivals or exceeds tropical fruits, along with fatty acids typically found only in fish or animal products. A mature sea buckthorn of 10 to 12 years will produce 20 to 40 pounds of berries annually, though harvesting them is a labor-intensive process because the berries are soft and the plants are heavily thorned. The practical solution is to cut bearing branches in late August and freeze them, then thresh the frozen berries free from the stems, which is far faster than picking individually. Plant male and female plants at a ratio of 1 male to 6 to 8 females, as the species is dioecious and requires cross-pollination by wind. Spacing at 10 to 12 feet. Full sun is non-negotiable for productive fruiting. Tree 10 is Juglans manchurica, the Manchurian walnut. Most cold climate orchardists do not think of walnuts as an option because the black walnut is cold hardy only to about -20 degrees Fahrenheit, and the English walnut is even less hardy. The Manchurian walnut shatters that ceiling entirely, documented surviving -45 degrees Fahrenheit in its native range and bearing reliably in Zone 3 conditions, where no other walnut species would attempt to flower. The nut is smaller than a black walnut, about 1 inch in diameter, with a thick shell and a flavor that is richer and more intensely nutty than commercial English walnuts. A mature Manchurian walnut of 15 years will produce 40 to 80 pounds of nuts annually. The tree is large, reaching 40 to 60 feet at maturity, which means it requires thoughtful placement in any food system design. Like all walnuts, it produces juglone, a compound that inhibits the growth of certain plants in its root zone, and this must be factored into any planting plan. Position it at the northern edge of your growing space so its eventual shade falls away from other productive plants rather than onto them. Soil pH tolerance runs from 5.5 to 7, and the tree prefers deep, well-drained soils, but tolerates clay better than most nut trees. Plant at 40 to 50 feet spacing from other walnuts and at 30 feet from any sensitive plants. A single tree will produce without a pollinator, but yields improve with 2 or more. The 11th tree is Prunus americana, the American plum, native to the entire eastern half of North America from Quebec to Florida, which gives it one of the widest climate adaptation ranges of any fruit tree on the continent. In cold climate orchards, the northern ecotypes of American plum are cold hardy to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. They bloom later than European plums and produce dense thickets of branches that actually insulate the root zone during extreme cold events. The fruit is small, about 1 inch, ranging from yellow to red to deep purple depending on the individual tree, with a flavor that ranges from sweet and mild to intensely tart and aromatic. A mature American plum of 8 years will produce 20 to 40 pounds of fruit annually. The variety I recommend for intentional food production, rather than wild collection, is Toka, a hybrid between American plum and Japanese plum, developed in South Dakota, that combines the cold hardiness of the American species with larger fruit size and sweeter flavor. Toka is self-fertile and cold hardy to -30 degrees Fahrenheit. It produces 2-inch reddish bronze fruit with a sweet spicy flavor that is excellent fresh and outstanding in preserves. Plant at 12 to 15 feet spacing in full sun. American plum tolerates a wider soil pH range than any other plum, growing productively from 5.5 to 8, and it handles clay soils and occasional wet conditions that would kill European varieties. Now I want to talk about how these 11 plants work as a system rather than as separate trees scattered around a property. Because the real power of this plant list is not in any individual tree. The real power is in how they stack functions, spread harvest across time, support each other structurally, and create a food-producing ecosystem that becomes more productive and more resilient every year, rather than requiring constant inputs to maintain. The organizing principle of a cold climate fruit system is the frost calendar, and specifically the relationship between bloom time and late frost risk. In Zone 3 and Zone 4, the last killing frost can occur as late as the end of May, and the first fall frost can arrive as early September, which gives a growing window of roughly 90 to 100 days for frost-sensitive blooms. The trees on this list distribute their bloom times across a range of 6 to 8 weeks in spring, from the Cornelian cherry dogwood, which blooms in February or March, all the way to the American plum and Saskatoon serviceberry, which bloom in mid-May. This spread means that no single late frost event can wipe out the entire harvest potential of the system. Some trees will always be through their most vulnerable bloom stage when a given frost event occurs. Spatially, the system is organized by size and by nitrogen relationship. The large trees, meaning the Manchurian walnut and the mature sea buckthorn, belong on the northern boundary of the planting area, where they act as windbreaks and where their shade falls onto the adjacent field or woodland rather than onto other productive plants. The nitrogen-fixing trees, specifically the autumn olive and the sea buckthorn, are positioned adjacent to the highest demand trees, meaning the sour cherries and the pears, so that their root systems interact in the subsoil, and the leaf litter from the nitrogen fixers continuously enriches the root zone of the heavy fruiting trees. This is not incidental planting. This is designed soil fertility management that eliminates the need for purchased fertilizers in a fully established system. The mid-layer trees, the Ussurian pear, the Manchurian apricot, the American plum, and the Cornelian cherry fill the central growing space at 15 to 20 foot spacing, forming the productive backbone of the system. The smaller plants, the Saskatoon serviceberry, the Prairie sour cherries, the Siberian crabapple, and the date plum, are planted in the gaps between larger trees, where they receive full sun in the establishment years and continue receiving adequate light as the canopy develops, because their mature height fits within the light gaps. The harvest calendar across this system runs from late June through October, with barely any overlap, meaning the processing burden is distributed rather than concentrated. Saskatoon serviceberries ripen in late June to early July. Prairie sour cherries follow in mid to late July. The Manchurian apricot and the Cornelian cherry ripen in August. American plum, sea buckthorn, and Ussurian pear ripen in September. Autumn olive and date plum peak in late September to October, after the first light frosts have improved their flavor. Manchurian walnut harvest runs through October. This calendar means that a household working this system processes fruit for roughly 15 minutes to an hour per day throughout the season, rather than spending an entire week canning hundreds of pounds of a single crop, which is the food preservation model that actually fits real working lives. Water management in this system relies on the deep root architecture of the trees themselves more than on any irrigation infrastructure. All 11 of these trees develop extensive deep root systems when planted in well-drained soils and not overwatered during establishment. The critical window is the first 2 years, when supplemental irrigation at 2 to 3 gallons of water per tree per week during dry periods encourages roots to go down rather than staying near the surface. After year 3, most of these trees are functionally drought tolerant in any climate that receives 20 or more inches of annual precipitation. The sea buckthorn and the autumn olive are productive in even drier conditions, making them the anchor plants for sites with limited water access. Your winters are not too cold for fruit. They are too cold for the wrong fruit. That is the distinction that changes everything. The bitter cold that breaks unprotected pipes and kills poorly adapted trees is the same cold that drives the deep dormancy these trees require to set fruit buds reliably year after year. Trees like the Siberian crabapple and the Manchurian walnut and the Prairie sour cherry do not struggle through your winters. They run on them. Your short seasons are not a limitation. They are a filter. The trees on this list complete their fruit development in 60 to 90 days after bloom, which fits inside even the most compressed northern growing windows. The trees that require 150 days to ripen were never going to work in your climate. These ones were designed for exactly the window you have. Your alkaline, compacted, or sandy soils are not a barrier to production. They are a competitive advantage. For the right plants, sea buckthorn thrives in the sand that defeats apple trees. Autumn olive builds fertility in the rocky hillside that starves European pears. Saskatoon serviceberry produces abundantly in the alkaline soils of the prairie that make blueberries impossible. Your difficult soil is not the end of your fruit-growing ambition. It is the beginning of the right plant selection conversation. If you are growing in a cold climate and you want to tell me your specific location, your zone, your soil type, and which of these trees you are most interested in starting with, drop that in the comments. I read every comment on this channel, and I will give you a specific recommendation based on your actual conditions, rather than a generic answer. The system in one sentence: plant cold adapted, regionally evolved fruit trees selected for late bloom deep dormancy requirement and nitrogen fixing or structural support function, spaced to distribute light access across mature canopy heights, positioned to stack harvest across a 15-week window from June through October, and managed with deep establishment watering and no ongoing fertility inputs, so that your cold climate becomes the engine of annual, reliable, low-maintenance fruit production, rather than the obstacle to it.